Picture this. The year is 1851. A man stands in a small Florida fishing town, population a few thousand, holding a piece of paper that will eventually make Florida livable. Not just livable, desirable, irresistible. A paper that will, in about a century, trigger the largest human migration in American peacetime history. Millions of people will abandon the cold states. Entire cities will bloom in the swamp. Theme parks will rise from orange groves. Retirement communities will sprawl across land that was, just decades before, understood to be uninhabitable. He is holding a patent, U.S. patent number 8080. He is a doctor. He's a mayor. He's a postmaster and a bank director and a church founder and apparently a man who did not believe in sleeping in. He has just invented the ice-making machine. His name is John Gorrie, and almost nobody has heard of him. The town is called Apalachicola, and if you haven't been there, well, that's exactly the problem. You get to Apalachicola the only way you should get there, by crossing the John Gorrie Bridge, a long, climbing arc of concrete that lifts you up over a wide, slate-green bay. And for just a moment up there, at the top of that bridge, you feel what early travelers must have felt, that you're driving off the edge of Florida, that there's nothing left after this but water and sky and the slow turning of the earth. Then you come down the other side and you land in a town that time has not exactly forgotten. More like time got distracted by something shiny and never came back. Brick streets, actual brick streets. Two-story warehouses with tin roofs that have been there since before the Civil War. A working waterfront that smells like salt and diesel, and something you ate once and have been trying to find again ever since. Shrimp boats sitting low in the harbor with their nets bunched up and their paint giving up the ghost in the flakes of the color of the old cream. This is Apalachicola. Population just over 2,000 souls. Franklin County, the Florida Panhandle, what locals call, with a particular mix of pride and defiance, the Forgotten Coast. And here is the first thing to understand about this place. It has been forgotten before, many times, and every single time it came back as something more interesting than what it was before. Let's go back before the oysters and the tourists and the peeling paint. Back to when this little town was, against all geographical logic, one of the most important ports in America's South. In the 1830s, the cotton economy is king, and cotton in those days flows downhill, literally, down the Chattahoochee River from Georgia, down the Flint River from Alabama. Those two rivers meet just north of town and become the Apalachicola River, which runs south and empties into the bay, and from the bay out to the Gulf, and from the Gulf to the markets in New York and Liverpool and beyond. Apalachicola becomes the third busiest port on the entire Gulf of Mexico, behind only New Orleans and Mobile. Sidewheel steamboats churn through the bay carrying cotton bales, stacked to the smokestacks. The docks are chaos. The warehouses are full. There's money here. The city plan, still visible today if you know how to look for it, was modeled on Philadelphia. Wide streets and public squares, a certain ambition baked into the grid, the kind of planning that says, we're going to be here a while. We're going to be something. They were right. They just weren't right about what. Because cotton is fickle, and railroads were coming, and a civil war was coming. And one by one, the things that made Apalachicola a boomtown went away and left something else in their place. First, the cotton, then the lumber, Then the sponges. Greek immigrants arrived and turned Apalachicola into a sponge diving hub for a while, which is a sentence that still catches people off guard when they hear it. And then, steadily, permanently, the thing that would define the town longer than any of these other things, the oyster. Here's what makes an Apalachicola oyster different from every other oyster in the world. And if you have never had one, I apologize in advance for what I'm about to do. Apalachicola Bay is a bowl protected on three sides by barrier islands: St. George, St. Vincent, and Dog Island. The bay sits like a cupped hand between the land and the Gulf, and into this bowl pours fresh water from the Apalachicola River, cold, clear, nutrient-rich water from three states, from Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, filtered through forests and wetlands before it arrives here. The result is a perfectly calibrated, brackish environment. Not too salty, not too fresh. The exact blend that produces oysters, which are widely agreed to be among the finest oysters ever coaxed out of the sea. Plump, sweet, with a slight brine finish that suggests the sea without beating you over the head with it. By 1836, locals were harvesting and selling them. By 1850, they were being packed in barrels and shipped north. By 1896, Apalachicola was exporting 50,000 cans of oysters per day. Not per week, per day. At one point, this tiny town was producing more than 90% of Florida's entire oyster supply. Think about that the next time you order oysters in Miami, or Tampa, or Jacksonville. For most of the 20th century, you were almost certainly eating an Apalachicola oyster, and Apalachicola was almost certainly not getting sufficient credit for it. The oystermen worked the bay in shallow draft skiffs, tonguing the beds with long, scissor-shaped tools. The same basic technique, incidentally, that was being used when Andrew Jackson was president. There's something almost deliberately stubborn about that. The world changed all around them, and the men in the boats kept tonguing, kept shucking, kept stacking the shells back in the water to give them the next generation of spat somewhere to settle. It worked for a long time. It worked remarkably well, and then it didn't. To understand what happened to the oysters, you have to understand a fight that has been going on for over 30 years between three states, two river systems, and the ever-expanding thirst of metropolitan Atlanta. The tri-state water wars, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, locked in an ongoing legal and political battle over how much fresh water Georgia can pull from the Chattahoochee River system, the same river system that feeds Apalachicola Bay. Atlanta grew. Atlanta kept growing. Atlanta showed absolutely no inclination to stop growing. In every new subdivision, every new golf course, every new car wash in the greater Atlanta metro area pulled just a little more water from the system before it ever got south to the bay. Less fresh water in the bay means higher salinity. Higher salinity means the delicate balance that created the perfect Apalachicola oyster starts to tip. Then add a severe drought in 2012. Then add the after effects of an oil spill in the Gulf the year before. Then add decades of overharvesting. The oyster beds that had sustained this community since before the Civil War collapsed almost overnight. The oystermen, families who had worked these waters for generations, faced a reckoning that had nothing to do with their skill or their effort or their knowledge of the bay. It was a reckoning that came from a boardroom in Atlanta and a courtroom in Washington, and a pipeline decision made by people who had never once eaten an Apalachicola oyster in their lives. There's something almost Greek in the tragedy of it. The forces that built this place also, eventually, had the power to unmake it. The good news, and there's always good news, is that the bay has shown signs of recovery. The harvest ban began to lift in 2025. Aquaculture operations continued through the closure. The oysters are coming back, cautiously, the way things come back in Florida, slowly, stubbornly, and with a kind of patience that puts the humans around them to shame. But we've been putting off the main event, the story that gives this town its most improbable and most underappreciated distinction, the story of John Gorrie. Born in 1803 on the Caribbean island of Nevis, raised in South Carolina, trained as a physician in upstate New York. In 1833, a young John Gorrie arrived in Apalachicola looking for a place to practice medicine. What he found was a booming cotton port with a serious public health problem. Summer in Apalachicola in the 1830s was not the carefully air-conditioned experience it is today. It was hot, deeply, persistently, body hot. The kind of hot that sits on you and doesn't move. The marshes and swamps that surrounded the town exhaled what was then called miasma. Bad air, literally, the foul exhalation of the lowlands that people believed was the source of disease. They weren't entirely wrong about the result. They were entirely wrong about the cause. The diseases, yellow fever, malaria, were being spread by mosquitoes, not air. But in the 1830s, nobody knew that. What they knew was that every summer, people got sick and died. John Gorrie, as the town physician, watched it happen year after year and found it professionally unacceptable. He became obsessed with cooling. Cool air, he reasoned, drove away miasma. Cool air reduced fevers. Cool air kept patients alive. He hung buckets of ice in his hospital wards, positioned them to let cool air drift down over the sick beds below. And it worked. Patients survived who might otherwise have died. There was only one problem: ice. In 1840s Apalachicola, Florida, did not grow locally. Ice came from up the north, from the frozen lakes of Massachusetts and Maine, cut into blocks in winter, packed in sawdust, loaded onto ships, and delivered to Gulf ports at the staggering cost of $1.50 per pound. At a time when a skilled worker earned $15 a week, cooling one hospital room for one day required 500 pounds of ice. You don't need a calculator to understand that this was not sustainable. So Gorrie did what people in Apalachicola apparently have always done when the world is not providing what they need. He invented something. The mechanics of what John Gorrie figured out are worth understanding because they're almost preposterous in their elegance. He took ordinary air, compressed it, squeezed it down hard, which heated it to 500 degrees. Then he introduced a small amount of water, which dropped the temperature dramatically through evaporation. Then he let the compressed air expand back out to normal pressure. When gas expands, it cools. This is not magic, this is thermodynamics. But in a practical sense, in a Florida hospital ward in 1844, the result was cold air, ice, something that had never existed south of Virginia except as cargo. By 1850, Gorrie's iron machine, roughly the size of a modern refrigerator, could produce a brick of ice in about 2 hours. He applied for a patent. The U.S. Patent Office granted it on May 6, 1851. Patent number 8080. The first U.S. patent ever issued for mechanical refrigeration. He was not celebrated. He was not funded. He was not carried through the streets of Apalachicola on the shoulders of grateful citizens who could now keep their beer cold. What happened to John Gorrie was considerably less pleasant. At the time, Gorrie was puttering around his compressed air contraption in a small Florida town. The American ice trade was controlled by a Boston merchant named Frederick Tudor, who had built a global monopoly on harvesting, storing, and shipping natural ice. Tudor was known, with only modest exaggeration, as the Ice King. He supplied ice to the American South, to the Caribbean, to India. He had warehouses and ships and a vertically integrated supply chain that would have made modern logistics executives weep with envy. And then a country doctor in Apalachicola announced he could make ice out of thin air for free anywhere in the world at any time of year. You can imagine how the Ice King felt about this. The press attacks began almost immediately. Gorrie's machine was mocked. Editorials questioned whether artificial ice was safe to consume. There were suggestions, dark, unsubstantiated suggestions, that man-made ice was unwholesome, unnatural, perhaps even an affront to the proper order of things. The ice industry, which had every financial incentive to see Gorrie fail and the resources to help ensure it, made its presence felt in the newspapers of the day. Gorrie's business partner died. Funding dried up. The roadshow he took through southern cities trying to raise money to manufacture his machine came up empty. He returned to Apalachicola. He tried again. He failed again. In 1855, at the age of 51, John Gorrie died in Apalachicola, largely unrecognized, never having seen a single commercial application of the thing he invented. He was buried in the local cemetery, a man who had been a doctor, a mayor, a postmaster, a bank director, a city treasurer, a church founder, and the inventor of mechanical refrigeration died without ever knowing that his idea would eventually transform the entire American South, that it would make Florida, his Florida, into the fourth most populous state in the nation. That without his patent, the retirement communities and the theme parks and the strip malls and the snowbirds would simply not exist. In 1899, 44 years after his death, the Southern Ice Exchange, which had by then made a considerable amount of money off his invention, erected a monument to him in Apalachicola in front of the Episcopal church he helped found. The monument that the ice industry built to honor the man the ice industry destroyed stands there today. If that's not Florida in a paragraph, I'm not sure what is. In 1914, the state of Florida chose John Gorrie to represent the state in the National Statuary Hall at the United States Capitol. His statue stands there today, nice and cool inside, which, given who the statue is of, seems about right. And in Apalachicola, in a small building on 6th Street that most people drive right past, there's a state museum dedicated entirely to John Gorrie. It's not large. It doesn't have an IMAX screen or an interactive digital experience. It has a 3/4 scale replica of the ice machine, some period artifacts, a knowledgeable park ranger, and a $2 admission price that feels almost apologetic. It is, by every metric, undervisited, which means that when you go, and you should go, you will almost certainly have the place to yourself. You and the ranger and a machine that changed the world, and the ghost of a man who never got to know it. Here's the irony that this town carries around with it, quietly, like a card it never quite plays. The invention that made Florida livable came from Apalachicola. The patents, and the physics, and the compressed air. All of it originated here, in this town that still looks, on a hot August afternoon like it's daring the heat to do its worst. Air conditioning rewrote American geography. It emptied the Midwest and filled the Sun Belt. It made Phoenix and Houston and Miami and Orlando not just survivable, but desirable. It moved the population of the country slowly and permanently towards warmth. The United States Census tells a story in numbers. The South and West gained millions of residents over the 20th century, and a significant portion of that migration was simply people following the cool air that John Gorrie had taught us how to make. In the middle of all that, the glittering condos and the 6-lane highways and the controlled climate existence that now defines Florida sits Apalachicola, still on the brick streets, still with shrimp boats in the harbor, still with a general attitude that suggests it has no particular interest in what Florida became and considerable attachment to what Florida was. The town that invented the air conditioner doesn't feel like it needs one. There's something deeply correct about that. If you go to Apalachicola, and again, you should go to Apalachicola, here's what you do. First, you cross the John Gorrie Bridge. You can't avoid this. You will appreciate it. Second, you eat oysters. Find a raw bar. Find a half shell. Find something cold to drink and eat slowly, enough to taste where you are. The Apalachicola Seafood Grill has been serving seafood since 1903, which in Florida terms makes it practically ancient. Up the Creek Raw Bar sits right at the water and will remind you why the entire concept of eating outside near water was invented. Third, you go to the John Gorrie Museum. It costs $2. You spend an hour. You come out different than you went in. Quieter, maybe, or a little more grateful, or just more aware that the world you live in was assembled largely by people you have never heard of, working in places you've never been, solving problems that nobody thanked them for solving. Then you walk the streets for a while. There are more than 900 historic buildings in the National Register district here. The Trinity Episcopal Church that Gorrie helped found is still standing. And if the time is right, in early November, the Florida Seafood Festival comes to town. Tens of thousands of people arrive for oysters and blue crab races and the blessing of the fleet. Apalachicola means, in the language of the people who were here long before any of this, land of the friendly people. It still is. So the next time you walk into a grocery store and pull a cold drink from a refrigerator, or step into a Florida hotel lobby and feel that first blast of manufactured cold air, or eat an oyster at a restaurant that didn't ship it from France, or watch the weather map and notice that somehow, against all climactic common sense, people keep moving to the hottest parts of the country. Think about a doctor in a small Florida town, standing in a ward full of fever patients, looking up at a bucket of ice hanging from the ceiling and thinking, there has to be a better way. Think about the machine he built from compressed air and stubbornness. The patent the ice industry tried to bury. The monument they eventually built to him anyway, out of something between guilt and gratitude. Think about Apalachicola, still there, at the bottom of the bridge, at the edge of the bay, at the end of the road, in no particular hurry, smelling like salt water and oyster shells in history. The town is small, the story's not. And now you know the whole story. This has been Drive Thru Towns. I'm your host, Andrew Wilcox. A special thanks to Chloe Jones for providing our music. If you enjoyed this journey, please follow the podcast to stay updated on all upcoming episodes. To keep the conversation going, you can connect with me on Instagram at 50 State Family, find me on LinkedIn under Wilcox Legal, or reach out directly via email at wilcoxlegal@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next road.
'Cause I was wandering free on an American dream with a million things to see and do. But it's all good, I'm fine. Had the time of my life, 'cause I did it all